responsibility means you got to cut services for the population. You got to cut benefits that help people. You keep the benefits to the rich. That's what the federal spending and a tax cut are about. Well, during the Reagan years, that's exactly what was done, and it was harmful. It was harmful even to economic growth, although there was some, but it was very harmful to the general population. It was 10 years of either stagnation or decline for most people. U.S. working hours went to the highest in the industrial world. For incomes either stagnated or declined. Working conditions declined. This was called a welcome development of transcendent importance by the Wall Street Journal, which tells you exactly what was going on. Well, it was highly unpopular, as you can imagine. There's a lot of mythology about Reagan's popularity. It's simply untrue. In fact, at the end, by 1992, he was ranked as the most unpopular living ex-president, right next to Richard Nixon, well below Carter and Ford. Well, how'd they stay in power? Pressing the panic button every year, just what they're doing now. So they started right off with, it was recognized right away that Libya is a very convenient punching bag. It's completely defenseless. Everybody hates it. You can do what you want. So they started attacking Libya right away and presenting Libya as a threat. In 1981, Reagan was hiding in the White House because he had to be protected from Libyan hitmen who were wandering around the streets of Washington, and nobody could do anything about them. They're going to kill our leader. Well, somehow he escaped. Libya was trying to expel us from the world. He said nothing less than that. 2 years later came that air base in Grenada, which the Russians were going to use to bomb us. And then there was Nicaragua, 2 days driving time from Harlingen, Texas. Remember that? They were really close. And waving copies of Mein Kampf, according to the Secretary of State. A real threat. Reagan called a national emergency in 1985 to defend the country from the threat to the security of the United States posed by the government of Nicaragua. The Martian would be dying of laughter, I guess, but people here didn't laugh. In fact, if you look at that, that was renewed annually right through the 80s. You take a look at it, it's almost the same wording as the congressional resolution in October 2002 about the threat of Saddam Hussein. Imminent threat to the security of the United States. You've got to do something. In the 1980s, it meant a terrorist war against Nicaragua. Ended up with the U.S. had to defy the World Court. The Security Council continued, destroyed the country practically. The other countries even worse. In 1988, George Bush was able to get elected, George Bush #1, but only by invoking the threat of black criminal rapists. Willie Horton, you remember that? That's how he got elected. Terrified everyone. There were crime frenzies, drug frenzies, just on and on. The international policies then were the same as now. The Reagan administration came into office in 1981, declaring that a war on terror would be the focus of U.S. foreign policy, a war against depraved opponents of civilization itself and a return to barbarism in our time, on and on. And it very quickly turned into a terrorist war. They devastated Central America, the Middle East. It was all over the world. The U.S. supported South Africa right through the 1980s. The Reagan administration had to find ways to get around congressional legislation calling sanctions. They were able to increase trade and support for South Africa right to the end. Just in the Reagan years alone, South African depredations in the surrounding countries, in Angola and Mozambique, killed about 1.5 million people. It's not small. That's when ends up with Colin Powell, the moderate, as National Security Advisor. In 1988, the U.S. declared Nelson Mandela's African National Congress to be one of the more notorious terrorist organizations in the world. That's part of the reason for supporting the South African apartheid regime. In 1987, December 1987, the U.S. voted against, that means essentially vetoed, the strongest UN resolution, General Assembly resolution, condemning terror in all its forms. It's the strongest resolution the UN has passed. The U.S. voted against it. The U.S. and Israel alone voted against it. The reason was it had a paragraph in it which said that though they condemn terrorism and have to do everything to stop it, nothing in this resolution prevents the people from struggling against racist and colonialist regimes or foreign military occupation. And the U.S. doesn't accept that. We don't think people have a right to struggle against racist and colonialist regimes and foreign military occupation. Racist and colonialist regimes referred to South Africa. Military occupation referred to Israel. The U.S. alone voted against it, Israel reflexively. Accordingly, it's not reported. And it's not part of history, except that it is part of history. And it tells you a lot about what's going on. It's December 1987. Well, it continues like that. At that time, they were constrained. There was a deterrent. There's a limit on what you can do. The deterrent's gone. You go on to the national security strategy, uses September 11th as a pretext. The pretext is used by states all over the world. The Russians immediately used it as a pretext for stepping up their really vicious terrorist atrocities in Chechnya, assuming correctly they'd get U.S. endorsement for it. China did the same. Israel did the same in the occupied territories. It's all over. Also, states all over the world, from the Central Asian terrorist dictatorships that Bush backs to the more democratic countries all over the world, it was used as a pretext to discipline their own populations. We know what happened here. The Bush administration has made extraordinary claims, and they've been upheld by the courts to a large extent. They've claimed the right to imprison people, including U.S. citizens, without charge, without access to lawyers or family, and to do so indefinitely until the president declares that an emergency is over, which means executive authority. That's an astonishing claim. George Bush is supposed to have a bust of Winston Churchill on his desk that was given to him by his friend Tony Blair. Churchill had some things to say about this. You might listen to them. He said, "The power of the executive to cast a man into prison without formulating any charge known to the law and to deny him the judgment of his peers is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian government, whether Nazi or communist." That was that's what is being claimed and implemented by the United States. Churchill said this in 1943. Britain was in very serious straits at that time. They were under attack by the most murderous military force in history and came close to being destroyed. That's the moment at which Churchill declared that. And whatever you think about the threats to the United States, and nothing like that. And he's right. It is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian government, whether Nazi or communist or Washington right now. Those are just plain facts. Take a look. And it's getting worse. There's a new Justice Department proposal, which is being called Patriot 2. It was secret, but it was leaked. It was leaked by somebody who didn't like it. And there have been a couple of reports about it in the press. You can actually read it. It's posted on the internet. NYU law professor Jack Balkan, who wrote about it, says the following: there is no civil right, not even the precious right of citizenship, that this administration will not abuse to secure ever greater control over American life. And if you read the proposal, he's exactly right. It even grants the Justice Department the right to take away citizenship just by inference, what they call inference, not any actual actions. They somehow infer from something they don't like that they don't like you, they can take away your citizenship. Nothing's ever been claimed like that. That goes far beyond what Churchill described as in the highest degree odious. Well, whether that's implemented or not is up to us. Alan Gilbert here has a recent book which he opens by quoting James Madison, who warned about those who seize upon dangers abroad to blind your eyes to dangers at home. That rings pretty true, worth thinking about. Well, September 11th was the pretext. National Security Council security strategy was announced. Election campaign came along. The doctrine was announced, the doctrine of war against anybody you don't like, preventive war. The purpose is to establish that as a norm of behavior, what international legal scholars will call a new norm in international law. But to establish a norm, you have to do more than declare it. You have to illustrate it. You have to carry it out. You got to show that you're going to do it. Then it becomes a norm if you're a rich and powerful country, not if you're somebody else. Well, how do you do it? You got to pick a target. Target has to meet several conditions. One condition is it has to be defenseless. You got to make sure that you're going to have an overwhelming victory so you can rejoice over the destruction of people from a safe distance. Secondly, it's got to be important. So like there's no point going after, Burundi or some place like that. It's got to be a place that matters. Okay, what state satisfies those two conditions? Completely defenseless and very important. Well, that's Iraq. It's been utterly devastated by a decade of sanctions. It's the weakest country in the region, which is why it's not feared, no matter how much it's hated. Even in Kuwait and Iran, which Saddam invaded, not feared. In fact, for the last 5 years, they've been trying to reintegrate it into the regional system over strong U.S. objectives. It's the United States that fears it alone, just like it feared Nicaragua and Grenada and other demons. And it's extremely important. It has the second largest oil reserves in the world. Back as far back as 1945, the State Department described Persian Gulf oil resources as, in their words, a stupendous source of strategic power, one of the greatest material prizes in world history. Ever since then, the U.S. has been determined to control it. It's a leading principle of foreign policy. Actually, it goes back before, but it was the British before. And it's understandable. You don't give away a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. It's important to recognize that means control, not access. The U.S. didn't need the oil. In fact, it barely needs it today. Look at intelligence projections. They're expecting to rely on more secure Atlantic Basin resources, Western Africa, Western Hemisphere. But they want to control it, just as they did after the Second World War. And there's a reason for that. If you control a stupendous source of strategic power, you control the world. That's a lever of world control. You have what planners at the time called veto power over other countries. You can also set prices and production levels within the range that you want, and you can make sure that the profits flow back into the right pockets. It is enormous. To gain control over this resource and to have probably military bases there is a tremendous achievement for world control, if that's what you're aiming at. You read counter-arguments to this, and they're worth looking at. So it's argued that can't be true because the costs of reconstruction are going to be greater than the profits that will be made. Well, maybe that's true, maybe it isn't, but it's totally irrelevant. And the reason is because the costs of reconstruction are going to be paid by the taxpayer, by you. and the profits are going to go right into the pockets of the energy corporations. So yeah, doesn't matter how they balance out, it's just another taxpayer subsidy to the rich. Doesn't matter what the numbers are. So all the discussions are completely irrelevant. The profits will go to, Bechtel Corporation or Dick Cheney's Halliburton Empire or one thing or another, which will be chosen to what will be called rebuild Iraq at taxpayer expense. That's part of the way in which you transfer wealth and power from the population to the rich. Many ways, and that's one. Is there another way to proceed at this point? Yeah, there sure is. The United States could pay reparations to Iraq. That would be proper. And remember what it is. I mean, you're not reading about it in the newspapers, but you all know it's reparations from 20 years of devastation of Iraq. First 10 years of support for Saddam Hussein, right through his worst atrocities. The guy's now in office. They didn't care about the atrocities. Continued to support him, provide him with means to develop weapons of mass destruction. They even said why they were doing it. It didn't have to do with the war with Iran. It continued after Iran. The reason was because of, as George Bush #1 explained, his administration, our duty to support American exporters. That's why we had to support Saddam Hussein after the gassing of the Kurds and everything else. And then they added the usual boilerplate about Saddam Hussein being a source of stability and, we can help improve the human rights situation and so on. That went right up to the day of the invasion of Kuwait. First mistake. It didn't follow orders. The other crimes were fine. Then comes the war and a decade of sanctions, which have devastated the population, civilian population, and strengthened Saddam Hussein. And furthermore, made the population more dependent on him. I mean, he's a murderous tyrant, but a very efficient one. He had a very efficient food distribution system, which people were dependent on to stay alive. The World Food Organization says it's the most efficient food distribution system they know of. They say they can't duplicate it even by half. Monster, but an efficient monster, not the first one in history. So it forced the population to be dependent on him. It devastated the civilian society, strengthened Saddam Hussein. That's one reason why he's still there. Otherwise, he'd probably have been overthrown by now. Remember that Saddam Hussein was not the only monster who was supported by the guys now in Washington. They had quite an entourage that they collected. They were supporting, among others, Marcos and Duvalier and Suharto and Mobutu, who was the first foreign leader invited to the Bush White House. They loved them so much. Ceausescu is easily comparable to Saddam Hussein, vicious, murderous tyrant, supported up until the day he was overthrown by the people now in office. Every single one of those guys was overthrown from within. Why didn't it happen to Saddam, even though they were being supported by the United States? Why didn't it happen to Saddam Hussein? Well, the Westerners who know Iraq best have been talking about this for years. You don't read about them in the American media. You can't find the names in the New York Times index. You can read them in Canada or overseas, England or elsewhere. Namely, the administrators of the UN so-called oil for food programs, Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck. Both of them resigned in protest against what they called the genocidal effect of the program, the sanctions, and the fact that they were destroying the civilian society and strengthening Saddam Hussein. And they've been pointing out for years that the way to overthrow Saddam Hussein is from within, just like every other gangster that was supported by the people now in Washington. Can't happen if you destroy the civilian society and you strengthen the dictator and you make people dependent on him. The main effect of the sanctions hasn't harmed Saddam Hussein and strengthened him, but it's kept him from being overthrown. Otherwise, chances are he would have gone the way of Ceausescu and the rest of them a long time ago. But an internal revolt is unacceptable to the United States, just as Saddam's leaving Iraq is unacceptable, as they announced at the summit meeting. The reason is very simple. It doesn't leave the United States in charge. It leaves the Iraqi people in charge, and that's no good. At the Azores summit, Bush and Blair announced it explicitly. They said, even if Saddam Hussein goes, we're going to invade anyway, because we have to impose the regime of our choice, not the choice of the Iraqis, whatever that might be. That's critical. Well, that gives you some tasks for people here. One is to ensure the least harmful outcomes, whatever can be done. Another is to try to get to the point where we can provide reparations to Iraqis, and if we can't get to that level of honesty, at least to provide aid that they can use to rebuild the society the way they want to, and not the way somebody in Crawford tells them to. The next task after that, and Karl Rove just told you this morning what it is, as if you didn't know, was to face the next challenge as the new norm in international relations is put into effect somewhere else. And now that it's been established by this action, you want to know what it is? A couple of days ago, James Woolsey, who was former head of the CIA under Clinton and apparently is going to get a position in the new administration, he gave a speech where I'm going to be tomorrow, in Los Angeles, where he informed the crowd cheerfully that we're now in the midst of World War IV. There's World War I, World War II, Cold War was World War III, now we're in World War IV, and we got to go over the countries that have been attacking us. He named two. He said Iran and Syria. Fascist regimes of Iran and Syria have been attacking us, and we finally realized it. So now we have to go after them. So maybe they'll be the next ones. Or another possibility is the Andean region, which is now surrounded by U.S. military bases, plenty of soldiers there, and it's a big energy-producing and other resource-producing region, and it's kind of out of control. So that's a possible target. And you can think of others. But you can be pretty confident that one or another is going to come along. There's no other way to continue with the strategy that's announced and they intend to implement. Remember, these are people who barely hold political power by a hair, and the only way they can hold on to it is by terrifying the population. That means there are things that can be done. People don't have to be terrified by imaginary demons. That's an educational and organizational task, one that's not easy, but certainly within the means of people who are concerned. Well, let's go back to last September. Right after it comes October, Congress declares that Saddam Hussein is a threat to our existence, like Nicaragua, and authorizes the government to use force. Something else happened in October, something extremely important. There was a retrospective meeting in Havana, 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The people who attended were key participants in the October 1962 missile crisis from Russia, the United States, and Cuba. And there was a discovery that actually shattered them there. It turned out that the world they knew it was a very dangerous moment. Arthur Schlesinger described it as the most dangerous moment in history, which isn't an exaggeration. But they found out last October just how dangerous it was. It turned out that the world was literally one word away from probably terminal nuclear war. It turns out that Russian submarines were under attack by U.S. destroyers. They had nuclear-armed missiles. Two of the commanders assumed that there was a global war going on and called for the missiles to be sent off. If that had happened, there would have been a massive response by the United States, wiped out half of Russia. They would have responded out and wiped out the rest of us, and we wouldn't be here to talk about it. But why didn't it happen? One submarine commander countermanded the order. The Russian rules required 3 commanders to authorize nuclear weapons. 2 agreed and 1 refused. That's why we're here. That's how close it was. This is after a campaign of international terrorism that led to the crisis, aimed at regime change for the kind of reasons I mentioned, all very much in the news last October, very imminent, barely reported. I don't know how many of you know about it. It was barely mentioned. Who cares if the world was one word away from nuclear war after a U.S. campaign of international terrorism? What followed was an increase in the terrorism, and Dean Acheson's explanation, which I already read to you. Well, there are more important things than survival, like profits and power. That's what we learn from this. Immediately after this discovery, barely reported, a week later, October 23rd, there was a meeting of the United Nations Disarmament Commission, that's essentially the General Assembly. They passed two extremely important resolutions. One of them reaffirmed a 1925 treaty that bans biological weapons. The second was a resolution that extended a 1967 treaty banning the use of banning the militarization of space, preserving space for peaceful uses. Well, why those weren't reported? Those resolutions. Had a friend do a database check. Weren't reported. Why? The United States voted against them alone. The United States and reflexively Israel voted against reaffirming a 1925 ban on biological weapons and a 1967 treaty, now extended, to ban militarization of space. Well, that's really dangerous, both of them, and very urgent. Shortly after, but not reported. Right after that, the U.S., the Bush administration killed a bioweapons treaty that was under negotiation, stunning the Europeans. Last minute, the U.S. stepped in and says, no, we're not going to allow any discussion of enforcement mechanisms for years. The reason, got to protect the secrets of U.S. pharmaceutical corporations. It's much more important than banning biological weapons. Probably there's another reason. It's very likely that the United States is carrying out illegal tests of development of biological weapons. A lot of scientists guess that that's the reason why they claim that they haven't been able to find the source of the anthrax attack. It was traced back to a U.S. federal laboratory, remember. This is not like disarming Iraq. It's a U.S. federal laboratory. They claim not to be able to find the source. It's kind of hard to believe. But it may be, and it's been speculated by the Federation of American Scientists and others, that probable reason is that they're concealing some kind of weapons development program that they don't want exposed. Well, maybe not. We ought to find out about it. Right after that, the U.S. went on to infuriate even its closest allies in the World Trade Organization. First of all, by taking a very extreme stand violating trade rules. Notice that that's another reiteration that's still following the script of the Reagan years. There's a lot of talk about free trade, but they were the strongest opponents of free trade in the industrial world. In fact, the Reagan administration was the most protectionist government in post-war U.S. history. They virtually doubled protectionist barriers in the United States. The GATT, which is the predecessor of the World Trade Organization, according to their analysis, Reaganite protectionist measures were 3 times as high as other industrial countries. Very damaging to world trade, but the most powerful state in the world does what it wants, and they're doing it right again. The Bush administration has broken some new barriers and protectionist measures, but much worse than that, and this really did amaze and infuriate Europe and others, is just a couple of weeks ago the U.S. intervened to prevent efforts which had been agreed to by the other industrial powers, efforts to provide inexpensive drugs to people who are dying of treatable diseases, AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and others. That's tens of millions of people who are dying from these diseases, and the U.S. intervened to prevent access to inexpensive drugs, again because huge profits for heavily subsidized U.S. pharmaceutical corporations are a much higher priority. It doesn't make you popular. The U.S. also continued to and is continuing to undermine international efforts to reduce threats to the environment, which are by now universally recognized to be severe and maybe a threat to survival. The pretext for this barely conceal service to pretty narrow sectors of private power. If you take a look at the journal Science, the journal of the American Association for Advancement of Science, the lead editorial about a week ago was a bitter condemnation of the Bush administration climate change science plan, which does absolutely nothing. It does nothing to stop what just about every scientist who pays attention recognizes to be a very severe threat. Well, again, profits are more important. All of this engenders fear and hatred of the leadership, and maybe ultimately hatred of the society, which was regarded as just too dangerous. That's going to lead to efforts at deterrence. How do you deter a country which has overwhelming military power? Well, every international affairs specialist can tell you, and does tell you, by proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and proliferation of terror. That's what the Bush administration is going to achieve. As I say, Osama bin Laden must be cheering somewhere. Well, go back to that intelligent Martian. If he has some concern for the human species, he might be watching all of this with some amazement and asking how long it can be that people who live in a free country are going to allow it to go on. Thanks. I'm told that there are a couple of mics around, so if you'd like to go to them and we can turn this into a discussion. You start? Okay.
Hi, Noam. I wanted to ask about if we accept, and as I think we should, this sort of call to action as privileged citizens, what your estimation would be of two possible actions we can work for within the kind of narrow political spectrum. You've talked tonight about what was done by this administration and by some of the same people during Reagan-Bush, and you've also criticized Clinton, but not so much tonight. And I'm wondering how important it would be to try to work for the change from the Republicans to the Democrats in the next election, which is, it's a measurable change, versus other possible political activities like, campaign finance reform and that kind of thing.
Well, it depends what the Democrats are. So I didn't talk much. I actually did talk about Clinton. So the sanctions that have destroyed Iraq and strengthened Saddam Hussein and made the population dependent on him and prevented an internal revolt, that's Clinton.
Right. Okay,
and there's plenty more. Take another example, which is often another domain. Take a look at Brazil. It's very interesting. It's informative what's happening there. Very informative. Brazil has a huge popular movement, left popular movement, nothing like here. They succeed, and they're very effective. The Landless Workers Movement, the Workers' Party, and others, the biggest popular movements in the world and the most effective. They managed to elect their own president. Pretty impressive guy. Just take a look at what's happening and think a little about history. There's a good reason why nobody studies history. It just teaches you too much. But take a look at recent history. 40 years ago, Brazil had a populist president. It was during the Kennedy administration, not like Lula, but, mildly populist president. Kennedy administration didn't like him. They organized a military coup to overthrow him. It happened to take place shortly after the assassination, but had already been prepared by the Kennedy administration. It was hailed by Kennedy's ambassador as the greatest victory for freedom in the mid-20th century, while the generals were torturing and murdering. It imposed the first kind of neo-Nazi national security state in Latin America. That's the beginning of a plague that spread right through the hemisphere, ended up in Central America in the 80s. It's pretty awful. We ought to know all about it. This time, they're not calling for a military coup, although Lula's a much more threatening leader for them and has a mass popular support, organized support that Goulart back in those days didn't have. How come? Well, there's two basic reasons. For one thing, the activism of the last 40 years has changed this country as well as Brazil. People here wouldn't accept it anymore. Then nobody cared, nobody knew, pay any attention. But a lot has been done in the last 40 years. It's a much more civilized country. It'd be very hard to carry that off now. There's a second reason. Here comes Clinton. They don't need it. Back in the 1960s, the only way you could prevent a populist movement was a military coup. Now you can do it by the mechanisms of what the world calls neoliberalism. Financial markets, the international financial markets can strangle them. Capital can flow out of the country. What's called by economists a virtual parliament of investors and lenders can make the actual decisions over what happens in a country. Its own voters are irrelevant. The virtual parliament does it. Yeah, that's thanks to the what's called globalization. The measures that have been introduced in the last 30 years, primarily, much of it under Clinton, which means that, so like when Lula went to Davos at the World Economic Forum and made a good speech about how we have to, work on overcoming poverty and all kind of nice things, they cheered him. They thought, oh, that's nice, because they know he can't do a damn thing. Because the minute he makes a move, the virtual parliament will strangle him. Okay, a lot of that is thanks to Clinton. Those are other ways of controlling people. I mean, they might have alternatives, but they'd have to be almost revolutionary by now. That's what the global justice movements are about, trying to prevent the virtual parliament from destroying what's left of democracy by transferring power into the hands of the virtual parliament. Okay, we ought to know about those things too, and plenty of people do. That's why there's a big global justice movement. That's Clinton too, and there's more. Going back to your question, it's really hard to say. It depends what the alternatives actually are. That's why I was quoting Dean Acheson, Kennedy administration, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the planning commissions in 1940. Okay, the spectrum is pretty narrow. It's not to say that it doesn't exist. And sometimes choices within it are important. But far more important than that is changing the spectrum. And the way you do that is by the kinds of activism that have changed the country. That changes the spectrum within which choices are going to be made. Ultimately, you want to go beyond that. But for the short term, that's, I think, what has to be done.
Given that our government is the most powerful government in the world right now, how could we best utilize that power